Hello, and welcome to Deep Impact, a proud member of the Duff Network, where we dive deep into Wildbow's most underappreciated work 5 years on. Coming up next is Elliot Diebold.
And that was Ruben Morehouse.
And we are back to round off Arc 2, Damages, with Chapter 2.Y, another interlude.
Yeah, but this is sort of the first traditional interlude in the sense of how I think of interludes from the Parahuman series, which is just another character's sort of point of view or backstory.
Well, maybe the traditional interludes in Pact are just textbook excerpts.
yeah, exactly.
Anyway, so this chapter, 2.Y, we get into Maggie's backstory. And she kind of actually summarized this for us last chapter when she said, I came from a place that was falling through the cracks, and just like goblins might go after someone who's slipped through civilization's secure embrace, they'll go after a location, and it was bad enough that not all of us made it out.
Yeah, and that's a pretty good TLDR of this chapter, really. It's interesting because this chapter doesn't really go back to the present like at all. Like we get what's maybe 50 words dealing with the Molly incident from 2 months ago, but really this entire chapter is based back when she was, when her town was overrun by these goblins, and it really kind of relies on the information you got on Maggie from the previous chapter for you to sort of tie those two things together. There's no section where we, see, say, the most recent events from Maggie's point of view. It's all sort of left a bit up in the air there, and we're very much just we're meant to draw those lines ourselves, I think. Yeah,
it definitely doesn't make any explicit kind of justifications for what she did. It does kind of explain why she is so desperate for power and why she's in the mindset that she is that leads her to make that decision. But it doesn't really dive into it any more than that.
Yeah, definitely.
Anyway, so this story begins with Maggie in school. And I guess let's take a moment here to kind of point out one of the things I like the most about this chapter is it's a very small town. It's very much like, obviously bad things happen during this chapter, but before each bad thing happens, we really do get this picture of a kind of small town life that Maggie is living. It's quite nice. It's a nice life.
Yeah, definitely. Each segment starts out quite positive and devolves.
Yeah. It reminds me of Heather's. I'm just going to say it because Maggie hates her friends. Interestingly, her friend Heather. Maggie really doesn't like the fact that she's in high school. We kind of meet her friend Heather, and Maggie's just kind of brushing her off and not wanting to hang out with her.
Yeah, it's very much friend in quotation marks. Like I'm doing the little bunny ears thing whenever I say friend in relation to Maggie at the moment. But I think sort of, because this whole chapter exists to dive into Maggie. And I think the recurring impression that I got out of this was that Maggie's a bit of a natural fit for the world of practitioning, honestly. Like she was already kind of halfway there. And we're seeing that right now. Like this first bit is establishing she's a bit of a loner. And not necessarily in a sad way. Like, she has people who want to be her friends. She's just kind of like, fuck it. Like, I'm fine with who I am. Like, which is, probably a good headspace to be in as a practitioner.
Yeah, and not just that. The first kind of incident of this chapter is somebody has left a man-shaped pile of meat outside of their high school. It's horrifying, but Maggie kind of sees the tide of people moving away from it and goes to take a look. She's naturally curious about it. And she can stomach it for the most part. It kind of gets a bit worse and she can't handle it. But for someone who is entry-level practitioner, she clearly has a stomach for this kind of thing.
Yeah, and I love the way this meat statue is introduced. Because it's like she just starts off being like, oh, and this is what normally happens when we all leave school. But that's not what's happening. And there's, it's like a couple of paragraphs between of Maggie just saying, this is what normally happens and this is what's unusual today. But we don't even hear what's unusual until like a fair way in. And then it's suddenly, oh, it's a meat statue. Oh, yeah. And it's shaped like a man. Oh, and it's already rotting. Like she sort of notices more details about it, and we see this a bit more explicitly later. But it's like at first glance, a normal human doesn't really appreciate how horrifying this is, and it takes her quite a while of looking at it to actually process how fucked up this thing is. And because then we find out there's a living dog inside it.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's just it sort of it takes a while for someone to actually appreciate how awful this is.
Yeah, and it takes a while for Maggie to find that. She kind of is, checking it out up until the point where there's a live dog inside who has its neck kind of bound with wire to trap it inside. And we don't really find out what happens beyond that because Maggie can't watch it anymore. She's too disgusted.
Fair.
Yeah, fair enough, to be honest. So she kind of looks away and notices a man watching who seems out of place. And she takes his picture, and he just immediately notices that she has taken his picture. No flash, no noise. He just locks onto her, basically.
Yeah. It's cool because obviously it's introducing, like, we immediately peg this guy as a practitioner because we sort of know what's going on. But I love how this is also giving us like Maggie's quite perceptive, like this is again, I think, hitting that recurring theme of Maggie's a bit of a natural fit for this world. Like, she sees a horrifying meat statue, and part of her reaction is to just look around and see if someone's doing something weird, which is like, I'd be vomiting in the corner at this point.
Well, she very consciously makes the connection of like, oh, this was made to get a reaction. Well, therefore, someone must be watching for that reaction who's around.
Yeah, exactly. It's really clever of her, really.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's balancing that thing of telling us he's a practitioner and letting us know that Maggie's pretty bright. Like, she sees that something's up with this guy.
Yeah. So Maggie takes a picture of him. He drives off, but he's clearly pegged her. We jump forward a few days, and this kind of chapter has a number of just kind of jumping forward every so often. We've jumped forward, and Maggie's talking to her dad, and there are brief mentions of some of the bad things going on in town just to kind of set the backstory, but mostly it's just them having a really nice, wholesome family conversation.
Yeah. I found this bit very reminiscent of like a zombie film or any sort of global catastrophe film where you've got the radio on and it's talking about all the bad things, and as the viewer or listener or reader, you're like, oh god, like, put the pieces together, and they're just like, oh man, this is pretty bad, but nothing new, and they switch it off. And it's sort of giving us a bit of an insight how normal muggles, not Maggie, just to kind of like, oh, and they just switch it off.
Yeah, which is a beat that we get a lot during this chapter. And I think one of the main things that this chapter is saying is that no-maggers or muggles' inability to perceive, others and the supernatural really fucks them over a lot in situations like this. Maybe we'll get into that a bit later. I like what you put down. So there's a quote from the radio that I'll read out here. The police chief stated, "It would be fitting and appropriate if we did prove it was the work of out-of-control students to hold back their diplomas until restitution could be made."
Yeah, well,
I like what you wrote about this section.
I loved this because just as soon as I read police chief, I started thinking of lead, and I know that this is almost certainly not lead, but I couldn't help but notice that this statement does seem factually true. Like, for someone, if the police chief does know that this was like goblins or whatever, this statement is not false, and it seems so awkwardly worded that I have to believe that this police chief is a practitioner as well.
Or is it? I thought that after I read what you had written, but thinking about it, this is just kind of the doublespeak that kind of happens when you're dealing with the media and it's a case that isn't quite solved. I don't know. Maybe it's just kind of covering his ass a bit.
Yeah, it could be, but it definitely jumped out to me, probably because of the connotation of police chief that Laird's put in my head.
Yeah, and it would be fitting and appropriate if we did prove this to do this, which is very practitioner-y.
Yeah, it's very non-committal. But no, this scene in the car is great. Like, I love Maggie clearly has this great relationship with all three of her parents, but in particular her biological father. Like, I love this bit. She's constantly trying to be like a shitty, smart-ass teenager throughout this whole car conversation, and he really one-ups her by trying to turn it into a sex talk, which is just hilarious.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
and really gives you this sense that there's not actually any real like animosity between them. They're just two people who are actually really close, and they kind of liked playing off of each other.
I want to pull out something that I noticed later on in the chapter where we never learn Maggie's dad's name. She always just thinks of him as dad. And I think that's an intentional choice because there are places where could have made sense to just refer to him by name, such as when Maggie is overhearing a conversation between two other people, one of them being her dad. But I think the fact that he's just her dad is so important to kind of emphasize, hey, these two are really close. And it becomes very relevant later on.
And especially because like she has two dads. Like just using the term dad should probably be a bit more ambiguous than it is. So I think you're right. I think it's really the fact that we don't know his name yet is really used to establish how close the two of them are.
So we jump forward again, and things have clearly gotten worse. Her dad's joke about forming a kind of carpool of walking students has become a reality, and now all the kids kind of walk home to one of the kids' homes together and hang out there for a few hours until they can get picked up. Clearly the adults don't feel comfortable having the children out and about.
Yeah, which is like, this is only like 2 days, and really since the school thing, I think it's only been like 4 days or something.
Yeah.
So like, this has sort of escalated quite quickly, and you can't help but think, like, at this point, I'm like, I'd be the hell out of town by now. But it seems like that's not a super common thing to be doing yet, so it's kind of strange, because you're hearing how bad things have gotten, and you're thinking, why have you not left yet?
Why haven't they left? Yeah. And I think, again, it kind of comes back down to justifications, right? We get Chris and Maggie's dad talking about, oh, this is the town we always wanted to live in, and, you know, and kind of like half-heartedly defending why they should stay.
Well, you can think, if you didn't know it was a goblin invasion, you would, and you did just believe that it was some like restless teenagers or drunks or angry people, it's kind of reasonable to believe it would die down pretty soon, I guess.
Yeah, but even that, it feels bad. It feels bad, and it feels like the characters in this story, they rationalize it away because it's supernatural, and because of that, they don't kind of see the wholeness of how bad it is, you know?
Yeah, totally.
But, you know, this scene starts out nicely. Again, like I mentioned, it's like normal kid stuff. It's nice. It's kids goofing off. There's some Maggie does some really funny jokes where she pisses off at basically everybody.
It's some classic teen banter between, you know, friends. Again, I'm doing little air quotes. Because, you know, Maggie seems to get on with these people fairly well, considering she doesn't think of them as friends. But yeah.
Yeah, you definitely get the sense that she just kind of, she can get along with anybody. She'd just prefer not to.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So then stuff goes bad. The kids are heading back to Ben's house to kind of wait to be picked up, and they are stopped by the man who was watching. And he basically demands that Maggie deletes the pictures of him that she took. And she refuses. She basically gives him a lot of sass, and it seems like things are going to get really bad until a neighbor kind of steps in.
Yeah, I think it's really when the practitioner has to fight the neighbor that he figures the karma isn't worth it or something. But yeah, again, this whole scene just really reinforces like how naturally Maggie fits into this world. Like, she starts criticizing the guy's phrasing, like when he doesn't quite answer questions. She tries to like negotiate and make a deal. Like, she's kind of being very practitioner-y without even knowing about it. And you know, it's just kind of badass as well.
Yeah, she does very well. They kind of fight the man, a few kids versus the man, and he seems stronger than he should. Again, just kind of hinting that things are bad here.
Yeah.
The neighbor comes in, he kind of runs off, basically warning Maggie that she's going to get really badly hurt. Making it sound a lot like a threat for someone who is kind of trying to help.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really get this guy's whole story, but like Hero, even given what happens at the end of the chapter, Hero seems like a bit of a strong word, maybe, for all of his actions. What's interesting after this, though, is I guess because Maggie seems a bit wounded by the fact that they needed to be saved, and that, you know, she couldn't win the fight herself or even with her friends, and so she kind of starts bad mouthing the guy who saved them, and her friends call her out on this. Because she just kind of says some unnecessarily bitchy things about the guy. And like sort of calls him a pedo and stuff, and gets called out on it. And I think this is just sort of showing that she's not necessarily, or, you know, her reaction can be to double down when her pride's on the line. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she is a child, right? Like she does well in this scene to an extent, but she's a child and she acts like a child at times.
Yeah.
So they get back to Ben's house and there's a bit of lighthearted hanging out, but things quickly go wrong again when Maggie walks in on somebody who has seemingly killed Ben and his mother. This person threatens Maggie with a knife, but she kind of gets away, breaking through a window and kind of jumping out this first story window to get away.
Again, this is badass. But it's cool because Ben and his mum are never described as dead. She just describes them as lying face down on the bed next to each other, which is just such like it's such a wrong image. Like, and I immediately and I imagine most people when they read this, you're instantly like, well, they're dead.
Well, they're dead. Yeah.
but Maggie never quite sort of clicks to that, and I think this is tying back to what we see later and what we saw with the meat statue, where she doesn't quite process it exactly. Like, you know, it's just they're lying down. Then she's like, well, that's not right, and she never seems to make that leap to they're hella dead. It's just like it's just, you know, she doesn't quite process it at first glance. Yeah,
I mean, jumping forward a bit, it does seem like the things that the others are involved in has this effect of just being less able to be processed, despite it not being anything that out of the ordinary. Like 2 people being dead, that's a thing that happens in our world, but just because it has some association with goblins, it seems like they're less able to, you know, conceive it.
Yeah, exactly.
So Maggie jumps out a window and gets away, and we kind of jump forward again, and things are just getting worse and worse and worse. Her dad and Chris, his husband, are arguing about whether they should leave town or not, and Maggie makes a vow to never feel this powerless again, and I think this is a key moment for her.
Oh, yeah, definitely. This entire little segment exists solely to make this point, and I think this is why it's one short, standalone segment. Because I think Wildbow really wants us to understand that this is something that's important about Maggie, is that she's going to refuse to feel powerless.
Yeah, she's relentless to an extent, you know?
Yeah.
Yep, again, they should have moved away by now, but let's not hit that point too hard.
Yeah.
I don't know, I feel bad for this town, you know? Like, they're just unable to...
Yeah, these are all victims. Like, just
they're unable to process what's happening. They just can't conceive of it. Anyway, we'll get more of that in a bit, I think. So we jump forward again, and there's a council meeting, a neighborhood watch meeting, and Maggie's dad is going to go. And Maggie feels that if he goes, he's never going to come back, and they will make justifications for why that is, but they will never see him again.
Well, and because we've seen her... Like, she describes how she's doing this as well. Like, she keeps telling herself, Ben's fine. Everyone that I left at that house, they're fine. I just haven't seen them for the last few days, but it's for other reasons. So, like, she's doing this too. And, like, she's even like, she keeps telling herself that she believes it, even though she clearly sort of doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah, it is clear that she's kind of on the journey of breaking that cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
So eventually Maggie convinces her dad that they should all go to the council meeting together, because then at least whatever happens, they'll be together. And Maggie kind of called it, right? Like, she knew that the meeting was going to be useless. I want to read out a quote here where Maggie is basically internally contradicting everything that they say. So somebody says, lock your doors. Maggie thinks Ben had locked his doors. Leave your lights on if you have power. Stay in touch with your neighbors and let them know where you're going and if you're leaving. And brushed off with excuses and justifications if they disappear and don't leave a message.
It's
great.
She's really just hammering home that these people have no idea, and they're just saying what needs to be said to kind of make themselves feel better. She's almost channeling that anger you have at the clueless people in horror movies. You know, I've sort of said this feels a bit like a zombie movie, this chapter. And she's just sort of, you know, they're being like, oh, just lock our doors. And it's like, that's not going to fucking work.
Yeah, people did that. It didn't help. What are you doing? Don't go up there. No, don't recite the creepy ritual.
Yeah, quick, let's split up.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what her dad explicitly wanted to do. Anyway, the meeting is kind of interrupted when Maggie notices the creepy man from before kind of beckoning her outside. And she heads outside with her parents, and the man kind of reveals that he has been trying to help, but things are just going to keep getting worse, and they need to leave if they want to survive.
Yeah, and this is like sort of a big moment, because essentially for this entire chapter, Maggie has been thinking of this guy as the bad guy.
Yeah, justifiably, to be honest.
He's been suspicious and kind of aggro. So, but like she even sort of says, I wouldn't trust if you said you're not an enemy. And he's like, I get that, but like, this is way worse than everyone thinks, and you guys need to get out. And it's like the second he sort of validates that concern she's been holding on to, she's just like, no, okay, and just immediately deletes the photos and gets the hell out. It's great. Like this complete 180 she does mid-conversation, where just the second this guy stops being aggro and it's just like, confirms all of her worst fears, she just gets on his level and just bails and tells what he says.
Which really makes you think he could have been a lot more effective if he had just talked to them before, right? I mean, like, I guess he couldn't let them in on it, and he needed them to feel it, but, Anyway, so Maggie and her dads go to escape, but of course they are intercepted by a group of, in air quotes, people that seem off. Maggie notices they look off, and her brain is so overcome with cognitive dissonance that she just kind of ends up looking down at the ground because she just can't look at them, and she doesn't even realize why she's doing that. She's just like, well, I'll just look down here, I guess.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is her parents, or her dads, who are with her, still seem to clock into it a bit faster, and they're like, this isn't normal. Which is interesting because Maggie seems to have been ahead of everyone else with the rest of it, like knowing that this grander series of events wasn't natural, but she seems to struggle when she's really face to face with it a bit more. With stuff like when she's face to face with the unknown, she was struggling a bit more than when she knows what's going on. She seems very competent.
Maybe I think there is a bit in there about children kind of willing to believe fantastical things, but still kind of deferring to the authority of adults in the end, right? Maggie definitely feels like the defiant type that actually kind of just plays along sometimes,
Yeah, true.
Anyway, the leader of these goblins steps forward, and Maggie realizes all the illusions fall away, and Maggie sees they are goblins. And the goblin leader kind of comes towards them to fuck them up, but the practitioner kind of intercepts. He offers himself up in exchange for letting them go, and the goblins do not take this deal. They break him.
Yeah, I was a little unclear on exactly how all of this went down. I guess I'm still not fully clear on exactly how full-fledged practitioners work in practice. So she seems to not accept his offer, but then he seemed pretty confident later that she would have to. So I don't fully get it. But the interesting thing seems to be he donated all of his good karma to the remaining civilians in the hope that it would help them survive, which based on what Maggie's sort of hinted at later on probably doesn't really work out. So it kind of sounds like this guy really didn't work out in the end for him.
Yeah, so this guy kind of gets really badly messed up. Not killed yet, but basically taken out to the point where he's not really a concern anymore. And then the Goblin Queen offers to let two of them go. They will kill one of them and let the other two go. And, right in your head as you're reading this is what Maggie said last chapter, where not all of us made it out. And so you think, oh, okay, this is what's going down, right?
Yeah. I guess I cheated a little bit. I remember she's referred to having two dads before, as well in that chapter. So, I was like, well, unless she gets out with one of her dads and they moved on very quickly, or she got two new dads and she moved on very quickly, I think we're safe. But yeah.
That's fair. What actually happens is her dad argues that Maggie and Chris should be the ones to be let go, and the Goblin Lady basically buys that he loves them the most, and so tells him that she'll let him live and she'll kill Chris and Maggie just to fuck with him, basically.
Yeah, pretty much.
But Maggie doesn't let this happen. She says, "I will do anything if you let us all go," and the Goblin Woman agrees to this, stating basically that what has happened here will happen 2 more times to Maggie. And with that, kind of lets them go.
Yeah, and so what's interesting is this Goblin Lady says it may not be her, but that Maggie in the future or twice more will experience blood and darkness and fire. Now, I think when the Goblin Leader said it wouldn't be her again, she may have meant future Goblin leaders or something, because I don't know how much control this goblin leader has over the future, but I can't help but draw a connection between Maggie being an ally with Blake and this concept of blood and darkness and fire recurring in her life, because that doesn't seem like a good... Like, I don't think Blake should be hanging out with people who have essentially been prophesized to be around blood, darkness, and fire in the future. Not just because of all these nukes he's sitting on. It doesn't seem like a good idea for them to hang out.
Doesn't bode well for old Blake. But I get the sense that this Goblin Queen basically saying this will happen 2 more times. She's kind of just like dropping a hint at what's to come later in a way that the universe will just kind of make that happen. That's what Maggie agrees to, right? Maggie agrees to having terrible things happen to her twice more. And I don't know why this works out for the Goblin leader. I mean, it's hinted that gives her an avenue to potentially be involved with those things, but it kind of just feels like she's fucking her over again, right? Like, not really doing it for any point, just wanting to fuck with people.
Well, no, I think from the way the practitioner sort of reacts to this, like he calls Maggie a fool for agreeing to this.
Yeah. And
so, I mean, I can't help but feel that, you know, it is tying directly to the Goblin leader's ability to do stuff like, you know, she will be involved or something. But it's definitely, it's going to come back into the story. I can't help but feel like this will be a thing later in Pact.
Yeah. So the practitioner basically calls her a fool. Maggie takes his notes, and the practitioner's like, no, stay out of this. Like, the more involved you get into this, the worse things are going to be for you. Maggie does not take that advice.
No, and of course, like, we've had this thing hammered into us about how she doesn't want to feel powerless again, so of course she's not going to.
No.
But also I can't help but feel like the practitioner's probably right, and she shouldn't, so it's, yeah.
Yeah, the practitioner explicitly says, like, the more powerful you are, the more powerful this oath you've just made is going to be, and that means the worse that things will be. Don't awaken. But she does. And we finally jump forward one more time to Laird saying to Maggie, you know, I don't know too much about prophecies, but things are going to happen bad 2 more times, and they can happen on their own, or we can kind of make them happen. And Maggie says, oh, what should I do? And Laird tells her about Molly.
Yeah, which, again, given this whole context, you can see a bit more why Maggie was willing to make this sort of deal. I'm not saying it fully justifies it or anything, but it certainly puts it all a bit more into perspective.
Yeah,
but we definitely
advocate. Well, yeah, it is like Maggie. You can easily imagine that fighting a Diabolist could count as one of these blood and darkness and fire occurrences, right? So it makes sense that she would do it in a situation where she feels like she's got backup, but I don't know.
Well, I also just think she's potentially making a deal with Laird where he'll help her manage these 2 other repeats, which is important because, you know, whole towns could die, and, you know, you could make a pretty good utilitarian type case for killing Molly in exchange for having Laird help you manage 2 towns worth of destructions to limit fatalities, you know?
Yeah.
But
that's true.
We definitely don't still have all the details on all of this.
Yeah. It gives us we have details on why Maggie is who she is than what actually
it's definitely,
the blood and fire and darkness is going to be.
It's more of a character study on Maggie than anything else this chapter.
And that ends the chapter. That's the end of Damages 2.1. Not just the end of the chapter, the end of the arc.
Yeah.
But before we talk about the arc overall, what were your thoughts on this chapter, Elliot?
Yeah, I mean, I loved it. I was already sort of loving Maggie in 2.7, so and before that, so it was great to see that she's sort of the first character that gets a deep dive through an interlude. And you know, it was a little standalone zombie film, basically this chapter, and it was great.
Yeah, I think my favorite thing about this chapter was just the relationship between Maggie and her dad's. Like, it's just so wholesome and lovely, and it makes the stakes of this interlude feel real, even though we kind of know that the characters in it mostly end up fine, or at least Maggie does.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, let's talk about the arc as a whole. Damages. What do you feel was the point of this arc, Elliot?
So it's interesting, because even though this is arc 2, I think this is still an introduction arc. Like, I think arc 1 focused on, you know, here are the major characters, like, you know, Blake and Rose and I guess Laird. other rows. And then, also here's the major plot points on like magic and the major other players. And then Arc 2 is kind of like, okay, now that you've got the general idea and you understand things a little bit, now you're ready for the real shit, and it hits us with spirits, with karma. We actually meet all the people, and it's very much, it's like the introduction plus. Arc.
Yeah, I would say it feels like Arc 1 is about the people, and Arc 2 is about the world, right? We get our implements and domains and familiar textbook. We learn more about vestiges, how that works. We learn about karma and spirits, as you said. It definitely still feels like Blake and Rose are finding their feet a bit. Hopefully they will actually not be on the back foot for once soon. We'll see.
Eventually we might reach the stage where they're acting on things they were already familiar with before it tried to kill them.
Let's talk about damages, the word. Why is this the arc title? So
Sure.
obviously the obvious meaning of damage is things get damaged. And in this arc, Blake gets damaged pretty good. Physically with the fairy fight, emotionally with the Maggie stuff, and the kind of damaging of the bond between Blake and Rose getting worse and worse. That's one potential meaning of it.
There's a lot of literal damaging going on to various things in
Property
this arc.
damage, yeah, all kinds of things. But I think the other meaning of damages, the one that we kind of touched on, the legal meaning, as it were, is relevant here too. It basically means if you're awarded damages, you're awarded a sum of money or some kind of, benefit, I guess, in compensation for some kind of injury that you suffer, right?
Yeah, well, so you'll sue someone for damages.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that meaning definitely ties into the concept of karma, as we've seen it in the second half of this arc. I think, there's the concept in this universe of karmic damages being awarded to people or taken from people to make up for bending the rules. Yeah,
I think that's what the arc title is saying. I think it also kind of works for Maggie's interlude when we're talking about the deal that she's made with this goblin queen, but specifically, I think this arc is trying to point out, here's karma, here's the world, this is how it works, in introduction to what's going to happen later.
Yeah.
Well, before we wrap up the episode, we want to loop back around and talk about some of our favourite answers from our discussion thread from last chapter, where we were talking about people wanting to volunteer implement ideas for themselves or for fictional characters.
Yeah.
Do you want to start us off with your favourite answer, Elliot?
Sure. So I picked an answer from a user named Sarah Penguin. And this was a very, very thorough answer, so I can't go into all of it, but I think there'll be a link in the show notes for this episode. Sarah Penguin's been doing a lot of very thorough comments in our episode threads, they've all been great, but in this one they've picked a pendant as their implement. And Sarah goes into a bit of details on this, but I thought the bit that I really liked was Sarah Penguin's gone through all of the materials that they would make this pendant of. So things like iron and gold and specific gemstones to kind of try and convey specific powers onto it beyond the standard declarative and authoritative and sociocultural things that you would get from just a normal like pendant, which I think overall, you could compare to a ring or some other worn piece of jewelry. So I really like this idea of trying to put iron into your implement in the hopes that it would make it more effective against things like fairies and goblins. Almost to the point where I think that maybe there's a reason you can't do that because it's such a good idea that everyone should be doing it.
It feels like the kind of conceptual equivalent of trying to min-max your character in like D&D or something. And that alone makes me think this just wouldn't work. Like in an actual Wild Boar story, for some reason this would just go wrong, and you kind of know it. Like, oh, maybe it's really good against others, but they're gonna get murdered by some other practitioner or something, right?
I'm not sure, but it was such a great idea. I really loved reading this comment and thinking, that's a good point.
It was very well thought out, that's for sure. I picked out an answer by Bisexual Punch Party, who said that their implement would be, or maybe just an idea for an implement would be, a chef's knife. And I think this is one of the reasons why I like the idea of implements, because it just lets you examine the associations of everyday objects, right? In a way that you never really do in real life. So this comment is talking about how a chef's knife is a very specific implement. It has implied expertise, but only in one very specific context, which is just a great little idea for being a practitioner, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool. And there's some other stuff in there about how chef's knives can kind of form things or reform things. I mean, the act of cutting something up implies you're transitioning it to something else. So there's some other cool ideas in there. It's a fun way to analyze objects,
Yeah, well, because what's interesting is the concept of implements, domains, and familiars all tell us so much about the practitioner, but in different ways. Like, your implement is almost saying more about how you think of yourself than what's something that's actually true. Whereas I think a domain is probably more indicative of actually what you are like than just like how you think of yourself and how you choose to operate. And then obviously a familiar is not necessarily saying as much about you directly, but it kind of shows your other half. We kept having it compared to dating and marriage. And so these three systems sort of play off each other in such interesting ways, and each give you different insights into the person. It's so cool.
Yeah, I like that now we kind of know more about this. As we meet new characters and see more details of, implements or whatever for other characters we meet, it lets us kind of analyze them even from just a physical description in a lot more interesting of a way.
Yeah, exactly. And we saw that in this chapter. The practitioner guy had his pockets picked and a wand was pulled out, and so I was instantly making judgments about him based on that.
Yep. Bland, am I right?
British.
Yep, British, totally. Of course, that's why I fucked it up. Anyway, that's the end of Damages. We will be back in a few days on the 15th of February to be talking about the new Arc 3 Breach 3.1.
Yeah, and so you can find out more details on the show and all that sort of thing by going to the Doof Media website, which is doofmedia.com.
Yep. If you want to support us making the show or some of the other great podcasts on the Doof Media website, you can check out patreon.com/doofmedia.
Yes, and while you're there, don't forget to stop by Wildbow's Patreon, which is patreon.com/wildbow, since obviously he writes all these stories that we love talking about so much.
Yeah, and I think we should give a shout out to the Pact audiobook project as well. It took a bit of a hiatus recently, but Speedchuck, who is behind the project, has started updating it again, and you will see more Pact audiobook chapters coming out. It's a great way to force yourself to experience the story a bit slower and listen through to it. If you are listening through to the story with us and you want to talk about it with us, you can check out our discussion threads where we kind of engage with people who want to theory craft or ship Maggie and Blake or whatever it is. Discussion threads will be in the show notes of this podcast down below.
Yeah.
And that's basically it. Review us on iTunes if you'd like. You can check out our Twitter, and we'll see you on the 15th of February for Breaches 3.1.